Okay, so in the last video, we talked about what is cloud, what is AWS, how AWS has all these different services that do different functionality, and the general trend of you sign into your AWS account, you go into a specific service, you create something, whatever you create that's relative to whatever service you're in, and you use whatever you created to achieve the functionality that is designated to that service. So service examples include S3, DynamoDB, EC2, some of those ones I showed in the last video. So now we're going to look at how you can technically work with the cloud. So not as much abstract, and so this might be more beneficial to you if you're a developer as well as a pen tester, because we're going to see how you can technically make those API calls, and it might give you a good handle on how to interact with AWS, maybe if you're using it in your own corporate environment or if you're just kind of tinkering around with it. So I have this slide on, or I have this comic on the first slide of, the joke being that sometimes people throw around the word cloud without technically knowing, or without knowing the technical details of it, or don't have a good sense of how someone would go about using those cloud resources or interacting with them. So my hope is that after this video, if you won't just throw around the word cloud or containers or that kind of stuff, and if you do use that terminology, you'll have a better idea of what that looks like in terms of presence within the cloud and how to actually interact with it. So I'm going to talk about two primary ways to interact with AWS. The first one is going to be the UI, and that's what I talked about in the previous video. This is you go to a web browser, you sign into your AWS account, you click buttons, you check boxes, you fill out forms. It's probably going to be more attractive to someone who doesn't need to do a lot of scripting or be in the weeds in terms of AWS, because you can use the UI. Maybe you only have to sign in once every several weeks just to check in on some stuff. And the UI might give you a more intuitive option that's a bit more beginner friendly, and you don't have to know about a lot of the more, what some might deem more of like a technical way to interact with the cloud. And then the second part we're going to cover is the command line. So essentially calling the APIs from the command line or from things like Python scripts, that kind of stuff. And so that's going to be maybe more attractive to a developer who might do a lot of scripting on a daily basis and needs a way to script some stuff and interact with the AWS cloud programmatically. And then I'm going to show at the end, it's really a preference on which one you need to use, or whatever you need to use to get the job done. So the first one we're going to talk about is just the AWS website, so interacting with the cloud through the website. So I have the slide here. If you aren't aware, if you make an AWS account, you get you basically get put on like a free year-long subscription, and it's actually a pretty good deal, and you get access to a lot of resources that you might normally have to pay for, but because you're a new account, you get them for free for a year. So I think that includes some things like some smaller EC2 instances, and some other services. I might be incorrect, but check it out for yourself. It's pretty intuitive. You just go ahead and go to the AWS website, and then it'll show you, and I'll show this in a second, you can see where you can sign up for an account. And again, this is just signing up for a AWS account. This isn't necessarily like interacting with the cloud. We're not really doing services here. We're just like how you would make a web account for your bank, or how you would make a web account for maybe your healthcare stuff. This is just making a web account for AWS so we can then sign into this account and interact with the services. So again, cloud might appear complex and you might think it's really hard to get into the cloud, but the first step is just making an AWS account and getting that free year. So with that, I'll switch over to my Chrome browser here and show you what that looks like. Okay, so this is the main AWS homepage. So if you go to aws.amazon.com/console, you get a page that looks like this. Let's see, is this zoomed in enough? Yep. So you can see in the top right here, you have these two options of sign in or create an AWS account. So I'm going to go ahead and choose the sign in option. So I'm going to open that in a new tab. And if you go to the sign in option, you'll see you can choose to sign in with an existing account, or they have this button down here that says create a new AWS account. So if you're setting up an AWS account for the first time, you can go ahead and just click this button. So if you click on create a new AWS account, it gives you this new form, and you can put in the email address you want to register the account, and verify your email address and go through that whole process of setting up a free AWS account. Again, it's per email, so if you make an AWS account and you haven't had one before, you're going to get that free tier, which is super nice, which lets you tinker around with a lot of services without having to worry about the costs initially. For our purposes, I already have an AWS account, so I'm going to go ahead and sign in with it. So imagine I'm a developer, right? I need to make like an S3 bucket or something like that. I'm going to go ahead and retrieve my credentials. So let me grab those real quick. And then put in my password here. Cool. And so I sign in with that account, and now you can see I'm in my AWS account, right? This is just like signing into your bank account, signing into your healthcare account. This is just a web account at this point. Now that I have signed into my AWS web account, or I know it's technically the root user, but for ease of understanding, I'm just saying web account. So now that I've signed into essentially the website using those credentials, I can now go into my individual services. So like I said, I was a developer who needed to make an S3 bucket. Now that I've signed into my account, I can go into my S3 service like we saw in the last video, and then you can go ahead and create all the buckets you need and work with whatever you need. So the basic thing is you interact with all the services through the UI. Again, you have the recently visited here, so you'll see your recently visited services, and then you can search for any services you need at the top, like we saw in the previous video. So S3, EC2, Cognito, right? There's like a bunch of different services. Okay, and then with that, I'll go ahead and show how to set up the next way to interact with AWS. Okay, and so in terms of the second way to interact with AWS, that's going to be the programmatic way. To begin that process, I'm going to not dive into the specifics right now. I'm just going to show you how to set it up, and then we'll dive into the specifics of how to leverage that later. But just in terms to set it up, you basically just need access to some type of Linux. So some Linux distribution. In this case, I have Kali Linux running on VMware, but you just need some terminal. And then from the terminal, you're going to copy and paste some easy to follow AWS instructions they give you. And once you copy paste those into your terminal and run them, you'll have access to the AWS binary or AWS command to run from your terminal at the end. And I'm going to show that real quick right now. So first thing I'm going to show you how to actually find the article that has the instructions for installing AWS. So if you just literally Google installing AWS, the first article that comes up is an article that explains how to install it on whatever operating system you're in. So I'm going to go ahead and open this in a new tab here. And in the previous slide, I was talking about Linux, but it really depends on what OS you're using. If you're using Mac, if you're using Windows, they also have instructions on how to set up the programmatic command line tool on those specific OSs. In this case, we're looking at Kali Linux, so I expand the Linux option here. I've got these commands that listed here. So I'm going to copy these commands, and then I'm going to switch to my VM instance. Okay, now I'm in my Kali VM instance, and so you can see if I do like AWS help, nothing really comes up. It looks like you can install it through the package manager, but I'm going to be showing how to install it through the website. So, but I don't have, if I do which AWS, right, they're like AWS doesn't exist on my system right now. I'm going to go ahead and just paste in the commands I copied in that previous Chrome window. So paste those in and hit run. And it's going to go ahead and fetch the AWS documents, download them locally, unzip it, and run the install stuff. Oh, and I need to supply my password because it runs under root with sudo. Okay, so it now has installed AWS. So it's as simple as that. Now if I do AWS version, it'll give me back my version. If I do AWS help, it'll give me some more stuff. So this proves that before I didn't have AWS, I ran their instructions, and now I have AWS that I can run from the command line. Okay, now we've set up our AWS account through the website. The website you can think of as called the console. So we've essentially set up our AWS console account, and then we also just set up the programmatic or the command line AWS instruction by copying and pasting the instructions we got from the AWS wiki into our Kali Linux and running those. So now that both of those are configured, I'm going to start with more of a deep dive into the AWS console portion. And so for that, I'm going to switch over to the website and show you where you can find like region, username, and the account ID and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so this is our home page for our AWS console, right? Or basically our web account or console. So there's a couple things to note here. The first thing I'm going to do is zoom in so you can actually see it. But like I mentioned before, and I've mentioned several times, you have this recently visited widget, which shows you all the recently visited services you've seen. You can search for specific services up here. So if I just type in S3, I get a bunch of different services with like S3 in their name. So like S3, S3 Glacier, and then AWS Snow Family, AWS Transfer Family. Those are all services. You can see all of them by going to View All Services. Saw that in the previous video. A couple more things to note are when you make an AWS account, you need some way to distinguish it, right? Because like you could call your AWS account, and notice my AWS account is called presentation account. I've named it. That's the name I gave it that's the name I changed it to, because you can change it after creating it. But that's the name I changed it to for this presentation. But you could also make an AWS account called presentation account. So one of the things we need is kind of a unique identifier between AWS accounts. Just saying I need to access the presentation account, AWS account, isn't specific enough because you could have multiple instances of those. So when you make an AWS account, AWS gives you a 12-digit number called an account ID. And the account ID is just that. It's literally just 12 digits, and it's unique to your AWS account. And if you ever want to absolutely provide a unique identifier for your AWS account, you can just copy this 12-digit number. So your AWS account might be called presentation account, and my AWS account will be called presentation account, but our account ID numbers are going to be different. And we'll see when we're working with a lot of tools are going to ask for your account ID number, and this is what they're talking about. This 12-digit number gets used a lot throughout your AWS account to specify specific paths to specific resources. Okay. And so after the account number, then if you wanted to see like your username and your address and all that stuff under your account, you could go to this account tab, I think. I'm not going to go there because that actually has some of my details in it. But that's pretty much most of it from here. When you go into the specific services, we'll see that you have these different regions. So if I click up here, I'm in the US East 1 region, but you can see AWS has a bunch of different regions. There's US East 1, US East 2, US West 1, US West 2. There's a bunch of them. And then there's some that I think are disabled by default when you make the account. But this will become relevant as we're working with services, because if you ever need to ask what region am I in, it's going to show up here in the UI. So you can always go here, and if I need to switch to a different region, maybe I'm in US East 1 right now, but I need to be in US East 2, I just go ahead and click it. The page refreshes. And I have to zoom in again. And now I'm in US East 2. So it's really easy to switch between regions. You just choose it from the UI at the top here. So I just mentioned the AWS Amazon account ID. That's what we saw. I have it obfuscated here, but it's going to be too much work to obfuscate it in the video. Your account ID number technically isn't quote sensitive, but if you're architecting your stuff right, there's no real reason to disclose it. You can do some stuff with the account number, but you can't really do a whole lot. So it's not really sensitive. But so yeah, you'll see it in the video. I'm not going to try obfuscating it everywhere. That would just take too long and too much of a headache. Please don't just spam my account number though. Another important thing is if you have the number, there is no reverse lookup, right? This isn't like DNS, where if you have the IP address, sometimes you can reverse look up the domain. If I just gave you my AWS account ID number and I didn't give you anything else, you would have no idea what email that account ID number is tied to, or who owns that account ID number, right? Because when you make your AWS account, you have to give it an email. So it's not like you can take an account number and reverse it to an email. Basically, if you have the account ID number, but you don't have anything else, you can't really deduce anything from it in terms of who it belongs to. AWS also has regions. Regions are a way to segment and categorize their cloud offerings, essentially. Imagine if AWS just put everyone's pool of resources into a random, massive pool of computers, right? That wouldn't be very efficient. What if I'm in America and I'm trying to allocate a computer, but I randomly get a computer in India, for example, right? That's not efficient. That's like halfway across the world. I'm going to get a bit slower response times probably. And it's also just an organizational nightmare if you're dumping everything into just one massive pool. So AWS's solution has been to introduce regions. And so some of these regions are like US West 1 for Northern California, EU West 1 in Ireland. Per the name, it's geographical regions. And so what these regions do is for certain services, when you go to allocate stuff, so maybe in DynamoDB, I want to make a table. Maybe my company is in California, it's on the western coast of the US, and I want to allocate or make a table in the DynamoDB service. I'm probably going to want a computer in a region that is close to me. And then something I forgot to mention is these regions each have their own warehouses full of computers. So US West 1 is going to have a certain amount of warehouses full of computers to serve that geographical region. EU West 1 is also going to have warehouses full of computers to serve that geographical region. That's not saying that you can, if you're in US West 1, you can only use stuff in US West 1. You can deploy stuff to any region. That's just saying that for all these regions, there's a concentration of warehouses and computers in each one to service and run the stuff for that region. So back to the example, imagine you're a company in California, western coast of the US, and you need to deploy a website. You're probably going to, or you need to make a table in DynamoDB or a Lambda function in Lambda. You're probably going to want to create those resources in the US West 1 or US West 2 region because those are closest to you, and maybe most of your customers are in the US, so it makes sense to deploy those resources to data centers that are geographically closer to a lot of your customers. And I'm not going to go into this, but cloud providers also have this idea of redundancy, right? So if an earthquake happened and one of the warehouses full of the computers in it crashed, AWS has plenty of documentation on their site where they talk about within each of these regions, they have redundancy. So if one of the warehouses crashed in EU West or US West 1 and all the computers powered down or something, AWS describes on their site how they have basically like backup stuff, right? It's if your resources go down in one of the warehouses in that region, then they might jump to a different warehouse in that region. The regions also give you a sense of redundancy where if you're a company and you're deploying your stuff in US West 1, maybe you want to deploy your stuff in, I think it's US East 1 as well. So that way, if anything happens to the US West 1 data center, then you have your stuff backed up in the US East. Or sorry, if anything happens to the US West 1 data center, then you also have your resources backed up in the US East 1 data center. And so you can keep your uptime and keep all your stuff running. Again, there's redundancy within regions, so it's highly unlikely that an entire region will go down. For each of these regions, your stuff, there's enough redundancy built in that it's highly unlikely your stuff's going to go down. But it might be beneficial to deploy it if you, again, want redundancy, or maybe you have customers in America and Europe, so you want some regions, some stuff deployed to the European regions so that it's quicker for the European customers. Regions have a lot of benefits. The reason I bring up regions or spend so long on them is if you select the wrong region in the AWS console, you're going to get a different response. If I make a table in DynamoDB in US West 1, that table only exists in US West 1 within the cloud. If I look at DynamoDB in any other region besides US West 1, my table is not going to be returned. You'll get a blank response or no data returned. And so this can initially cause a bit of panic where you might go into your AWS account and you might make something. So sticking with DynamoDB, you make a table in DynamoDB and then you sign out. And when you sign back in, maybe you're in a different region and you don't realize it. And you go to DynamoDB to continue working on your table and your table doesn't show up. And you panic and you think that AWS has deleted your resources. That's not the case. You just need to change the region. I'll show an example of that in a second. The other thing to keep in mind is since regions are separate, you can create things with the same names and regions. So again, sticking with DynamoDB, maybe I make a table called test in US West 1. And then maybe I also make a table called test in US East 1. Those are two separate tables because they're in different regions, they're different resources, and they can hold different things in them. But if we were to go up to maybe a mutual friend and say, we need you to edit the test database, your friend is going to be confused because he's not going to know what test database you're referring to. Are you referring to the one in the US West 1 region or the one in the US East 1 region? And so we'll see in a second, there's essentially a unique identifier in AWS to help you differentiate that and provide an absolute path to these resources. Okay, so now I'm going to show that region kind of confusion I was talking about. So in the previous video, we made a Lambda function. So if I go into the Lambda service and I go to US East 1, there's the function we made in the previous video. Okay, so imagine you're a developer or you're just working on this Lambda function for one reason or another. You go into your Lambda function, you edit all your code, right? You put a bunch of code in here, you save it, you're all done, and you sign out of your account. Maybe the next time you sign into your account, you accidentally, instead of staying in the US East 1 version, log in under the US West 1 version, or somehow this changes. So instead of US East 1, for some reason you're in US West 1. Now that you're in US West 1, notice that the Lambda function doesn't appear because we're looking at a completely different region, we're looking at completely different resources, and so you didn't make the function in US West 1, so that's why it doesn't appear here. So this might cause some initial panic and like, oh, AWS might have deleted my resources or something like that. All you have to do is double check what region you're in and then switch back to the region where you made the resource. So if I switch back to US West or East 1, so if I switch back to US East 1 up here, my function pops up and I can continue working on it. So if you're sending API commands, if you're in the UI and you just can't get your resources back, just make a mental note and check to make sure you're in the correct region, because you might just be querying the wrong region where your resources just literally don't exist in that region. So this is a good example to also kind of foreshadow what we're going to talk about next. So I have a function in US East 1, it's called presentation function, right? And this exists in US East 1. That's where I made this resource. I could go to US West 1 and I could create a function and I could give it the exact same name. And I could do Python again and say create function. And that'll take maybe a second or two here to create the function. Okay, so our function is created. So if we go back to functions, we'll see we have a presentation function in US West 1, and we have a function called presentation function in US East 1. Now we have a dilemma, right? Maybe the code in US East 1 is different than the code in US West 1. So if we go to a friend and we're like, hey, you need to edit presentation function, your friend's not going to know which one are you talking about. Are you talking about the one in US East 1 or the one in US West 1? So we need a unique identifier to point to each of these functions in these different regions if they're called the same thing. That unique identifier in AWS is called Amazon Resource Names, or ARN for short. Basically, it's a string or an ID that combines a lot of the specific things we need to know about the resource to then find it. So, for example, we were just looking at Lambda functions. This applies to any service. ARNs are basically throughout AWS services. And so what you would do is, in the previous example, if you were talking to your friend and you were referencing presentation function or some resource that was named the same thing across different resources or different services, different regions, then you would provide an ARN. And you can see the ARN there includes the service name, the region, the account ID, remember that's that 12-digit number I talked about a couple slides back, the resource type, so Lambda, we've been talking about functions, but Lambda and some of these other services might have other types of things you can create within them. So in this case, it would be like function for Lambda, and then whatever the name of the thing is, the common name. So once you have that large string, you can give that to your friend, and your friend is going to know exactly what AWS account to look at, what region to look into, what service they need to look at, and what resource they're looking for. So a lot of tools we'll see in AWS ask for the ARN. Some of them will accept just the common name, like you could just pass in the name of the function maybe, but a lot of them will require this ARN because with the ARN, there's no real argument about where the resource exists. It's very clear. And so you can build the ARN using the format above because technically you have all that data, right? Like you know what the service name is, you know what the region name is, you know what your account ID is, you know what the resource type is. So you can build it manually, and I'll show in a second what those wikis look like. Or I'll also show that the ARN in most cases in the web UI is just displayed somewhere on the page. So you can just copy it because it's already pre-populated. To build the ARN manually, a lot of the AWS services have some documentation that shows you what an ARN looks like. So we were working with our functions in Lambda. So if I wanted to know how to build an ARN for that function, I would go down, I would search like AWS Lambda ARNs function, and then a page like this will pop up that says resources and conditions for Lambda actions. If I open that in a new tab, you can see at the top here they have Lambda resource ARN format. And so they tell me if you want to build an ARN for a function, you do ARN AWS Lambda, you provide whatever region you need. In this example, it's US West 2 in their example they gave on this page. Then you supply your AWS account number, you put function, and then you do the function name, and then you get into like function versions and stuff, which I'm not going to go into, but the point is whatever service you're working in, when you make something or you make a resource, you can Google how to make the ARN, and there's usually a documentation page like this hosted by AWS that tells you what that format looks like. In terms of finding it in the UI, because that's generally easier, right? If we go into, so right now we're in the US East 1 region. If we go into our presentation function in US East 1, you'll see the function ARN is right here. And so we can copy this with one click, and then we can paste this into whatever tools we need, right? And you can see this is like an absolute path. There's no debate what resource we're referring to. And you can see the region is right there, US East 1. So if I check on my function in US West 1 with the exact same name, you'll see the ARN is different because this is US West 1, so this region is different. So by giving this ARN to tools or whoever needs it for reference, it provides an absolute path to where the resource is. So you know what region it is, what account, and all the stuff you need to get the exact resource. So I just went through this example basically interactively, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it. It's just showing like what we just saw. You go into Lambda, you create a function, and then your function ARN shows up in the UI. So you can just copy and paste that and plug that into whatever tools needed. And then this is just showing how, if you switch regions and you don't see anything that's returned, that might just be because you're in the wrong region. So always just check you're querying the right region. One thing I forgot to mention is that some of the services have a global region, or it doesn't really matter the region you're looking at. They're kind of global resources. So probably the most well-known one is S3, and I'll show an example of that. But if a resource is global, then there's not different regions you have to worry about. And so an ARN still exists for it, but the region part is usually dropped. So let's look at an example of that. So I mentioned S3 is a service where the region appears as global up here. So if I just go to S3, I don't need to search for it here, it's just in my recently visited. If I open that in a new tab, and I go into my S3 and then I zoom in so you can see it, you'll see that up here it's global. And if I open it up, all these different regions are grayed out. It's because when you make an S3 bucket, S3 buckets need to be globally unique. So when you make an S3 bucket in your account, it's not like you can make an S3 bucket with the same name. Once you make an S3 bucket with that name, no one else in the world can technically make an S3 bucket with that name. So because of that, we don't really need to worry about regions. And so these are all grayed out and it just pops up as global. There's a couple other services, like I think AWS Organizations is one, where it's basically just global and you don't necessarily have to worry about the regions. But like I said, they still have an ARN. So if we go into like one of these random buckets and go to, it's probably under properties. Yeah, see how there's an Amazon resource name. So even though the region is global, you still have an ARN for it. The region, there just is no region part, but you still have an ARN. So again, some tools might require the ARN. You can just usually find it in the UI somewhere under whatever resource you created. Okay, so the past couple of slides I've talked about the UI, or I should say the console a lot, and even the last video I showed how you can create a console account, how you can navigate to different regions within a console, how you can get the account number, which is an important number once you're signed in, and I showed how typically you would sign into your AWS account and then you would navigate to a specific service within the console, and within that service you would make something to help complete the objective or whatever feature is relative to that service. So S3, maybe you'll make a bucket because you need to store stuff. DynamoDB, maybe you'll make a table because it's databases, so you need a table. But we probably need a programmatic way to interact with the cloud, right? Imagine if you have a website and every time a user signed in, you needed to change a DynamoDB entry, or you needed to upload something to an S3 bucket, or you needed to access some resource from somewhere. You can't have like a human sitting in front of a computer just waiting for a user to sign in to then click all the buttons and stuff. Like that's just unrealistic, right? You need a way to call the AWS APIs so that you can script it basically, right, and make it programmatic. And so what we installed a few slides ago on our Kali Linux instance is called the AWS command line interface. And it's basically like the most low-level way of calling the AWS APIs. And so you can either call the command line instructions, or we'll see in a second that these have basically been abstracted one level further and put in different SDKs. So there's like a Python SDK. Basically, there are several avenues in which you can programmatically call the APIs, and we're going to focus on the command line first. So the typical command is shown here at the bottom of the slide. Usually you have the AWS keyword, and I'll show this all in Kali Linux in a second. And then you have the service name, so this will be S3 or EC2 or whatever the service is. And then usually you have the API specific to that service. So in this case, S3 has an API called ls, and this will just list S3 buckets, I think. And then this final one, you don't really have to worry about. You can just think about it as of now that this is just providing the authentication for the command. And I'll explain what this profile flag is later and even show it. But for now, you can kind of just ignore this, and we'll discuss this later. But it's basically AWS service name and then command. So each service has a list of APIs you can call from the command line. So whenever I want to know what APIs are available for a service, this is usually what I Google. So I'll Google AWS, the service name. In this case, let's look at Lambda. So AWS Lambda CLI. And usually if I do this, one of the first links that comes up will be something like this. Again, provided by Amazon. And I'll open this in a new tab, and you can see AWS CLI command reference. And if I go into this window, it's kind of like a man page. Wow, that's really small. Let me zoom in there. It's kind of like a man page for the service. So this is Lambda. And remember, the command is going to be AWS, the service name, so Lambda. So it's going to be AWS Lambda and then some API name. But we don't know what those API names are. And so if you Google what I did basically for whatever service you're looking at, it'll give you all the APIs here. So these are all the available commands. You can see the first word is pretty transparent about what the API does. So like this add stuff, this create stuff, this delete stuff, this get stuff, so returns info, this list stuff, this put stuff, update stuff. I don't know what weight is, but Like, for example, maybe we want to get the details about the function we just created. So remember, the AWS command is going to be AWS Lambda and then the API name. So let's get function seems pretty reliable. So we click get function and then it'll tell you how to call it. So it'll be AWS Lambda get function, and then you can see we need to provide the function name. And it's saying that the function name should be a function ARN. Remember, we talked about ARN, so we can go grab the function ARN from our UI and put that in our command line. Again, this was a lot to like look at in a short amount of time. I'm going to show an interactive example that'll make it a lot easier. The point being, if you want to know what the APIs are for a given service, Google AWS service name CLI, and then a technical documentation CLI page will show up that will list all the different APIs you can call, and clicking into those different APIs will tell you exactly how to call them from the command line. So let's proceed with this API we were looking at. So we're going to switch to our Kali Linux. So now we're in our Kali Linux instance. I'm going to run AWS version to see that AWS is installed, and then we're going to proceed with that example with Lambda. So we're going to call the get function API on the function we just created. I'm just choosing a random Lambda API, a random get Lambda API to get something that we already created. How do I know the get function is going to return the function? It's per the name, right? It's pretty it's pretty transparent about what the API does. It's get function, it'll get a function. So I'm going to do AWS, the AWS keyword, Lambda, that's the service name. Then I'll call get function, and I actually already put credentials on here under user 1. So again, don't worry about this profile. We'll explain that later. Just focus on this part for now. So AWS Lambda get function. If I run this, it's saying, giving me an error that it's saying I'm missing the function name flag. Remember, that was one of the required flags from the documentation we were just looking at. So I'm going to go ahead and call it again, function name. And remember that in the documentation we just looked at, it said we could supply an ARN. So I'm going to go back to my console view, and I'm just going to copy that ARN again real quick. And then I'm going to paste it in my AWS call right here. So I'm back in my console in US East 1. I'm trying to get this function. So if I click on it, here's the function ARN. I'm going to copy it here with one click. Then I'm going to go back to my Kali instance. I'm going to paste that ARN in here. And now if I run this, I should get my details back for my Lambda. You'll see that it gives me some basic info about the Lambda, right? So it's like, this is presentation. It's called presentation function. Here's the ARN again. It's using Python. We'll talk about roles later, but like, this is the role that's attached to it. Here's the code size, the timeout that's set. And then you can scroll down. There's like revision ID, architecture, ephemeral storage, S3. Here's like where the code actually exists. And so you can see what we did is we basically, going back to our UI over here, we Googled Lambda CLI to get all the Lambda APIs. We then went into the technical documentation and looked at the get function API call specifically. We saw the get function API call required the function name. Looking at the description, it's saying that the function name can be a function ARN. So we just ran that command from our command line. And again, profile is the one that's providing the authentication that we'll talk about later. And when we ran the API, it returned our Lambda. So you've successfully programmatically called something in the cloud, right? You called the get function API from the Lambda service. It's important to mention one more thing, that AWS, the command line instruction, you can specify the region from the command line. So in the example I just did, here's the command I just ran. if I ran it in region US East 2, right? If I run that, I'm going to get this error response back. That's basically saying you're trying to get something in US East 1, and because it's looking at the ARN, it looks like, and it's saying you're trying to get something in US East 1, but you're saying go to US East 2. So let me change it a bit. Here we go. So I removed the ARN in this case, and I just put in the common name. So the AWS CLI here is trying to figure out, or is trying to basically construct that ARN based off the info it has. So I ran the AWS instruction, and I said, I want you to look for this in region US East 2. And it returned an error saying, resource not found. This makes sense, right? I don't have a Lambda in US East 2. I have a Lambda function in US East 1. So this is what I'm saying is, like, sometimes you'll run things with the wrong region flag, or the wrong region is being used, and it seems like your resource doesn't exist anymore, when all you have to do is add this -- region flag and change it to the right region. So I'll change it to US East 1, and now I get my Lambda back again. So we just looked at AWS command line instructions from the command line, but there's actually another layer of abstraction on top of that. It would be really burdensome if you had to use the command line all the time to run the AWS commands. So AWS has released, I don't know if it's AWS has released, AWS and other providers, I would say, have basically created these SDKs, or these software development kits, that basically do what we did in the command line, but in a more approachable scripting language. So rather than running Lambda get functions from the command line, we could use one of these SDKs. One of the more well-known ones for Python is called Boto 3, and you could write a script on the right here. So this script on the right will create a client with the S3 service. It supplies some creds here, which we'll cover in a bit for the authentication. And then it calls the list buckets function, which is defined in the Boto 3 API, and that basically calls the AWS S3 ls command, which then just returns all the bucket info. So you can see, rather than doing it from the command line, I can make like a script in Python and run that script and also interact with the cloud. This is just a slide showing the Boto 3 documentation. So again, kind of like how we Googled for the service name and added CLI, you can kind of do the same thing with Boto 3. So if we want to look for all the functions that S3 has, we can search for that in Google. So I searched for it over here, S3 Boto 3 documentation. First link that comes up, S3 Boto 3 documentation. And yeah, it looks like it is hosted under Amazon, AWS.com here. And so you can see they show you, or they list all the different, kind of how they listed all the functions for the CLI. They list all the functions that you can call in Python. So if we go down to list, there's list buckets. That's the one we were looking at. If I click on that, here's list buckets. It tells me what the response looks like, how I would call it. So if you're interested in programming Python, Pacu, which we'll see in a later video, is written on top of Boto 3. So if you want to write like a module for Pacu, this is what you would use. So if you're interested in programming languages and that stuff, I would highly encourage you to look into this documentation. So we've covered the console, we've covered the command line interface tool, and we looked at an example of the get functions API for the Lambda service. And then we talked about how you can abstract those command line instructions one level further so that you can wrap it in some type of scripting languages. The example I gave was Boto 3 for Python, but there's also other libraries and SDKs for other different programming languages. That being said, it can be a bit daunting to think about all these APIs at once, right? Because there's a lot of services, and each of those services has a lot of command line interface APIs. So a question you might have is, well, how do I get used to the command line interface, or how do I get started there? How do I sift through all these APIs? And a good strategy I like to do is to think of the parallel, when you're working with the command line interface, think of the parallel action in the console. For example, and I'll show this in a second, if you click into a service like S3 or Lambda, the first thing that will be returned is usually a list of objects from that service. It might be a list of functions, a list of buckets, depending on whatever service you go into. So when all that data is presented back to you, that's a good indication that there's probably an API called list something for that service. Likewise, if you then click into a specific bucket or into a specific function to look at it more closely, you're basically getting the details about that specific entity, and so there's probably an API called get whatever that corresponds to that action you did in the UI. And so that's more about reading stuff, and the same applies for writing stuff. So when you create a bucket or you create a function, usually at the end of the workflow, you click a button that says, create whatever, create bucket, create function. So there's probably an API for that service called create whatever you're creating, right? Create function, create bucket. And so if you're trying to figure out how best to use the command line interface, you're trying to think about what could be the possible APIs for the service, just think about how the console is set up and maybe how you would navigate that workflow. And each of those, I would say maybe like unit actions, will give you a good indication of a corresponding API. So I'm going to walk through an example here where we're going to look at S3 Glacier. So I have never touched this service really except for this presentation. First, I'm going to show how to create a Glacier in S3. We're going to set that up in the UI, and then I'm going to show how, when handed a service you might not know, how you can very quickly find the API you need. So I'll go through the slides real quick, and then I'll jump over to the console so that we can see the same idea interactively. So this is just showing how we're going to create a vault. That's what the entities are called in Amazon Glacier. They're called vaults via the web UI or the console. So I navigate to the S3 Glacier service. You can see it says vaults here. I click create vault. Create vault with the given defaults. Note the region you are in and the test vault name. So you literally just fill out a form and you click create vault. Remember, I said a lot of these actions have a corresponding API. So when I clicked create vault here, there's like a really good chance there's an API called create vault for S3 Glacier. And so then you get your vault created on the right here, and you can see it gives you the ARN, so you have like the absolute path to that. And now let's think about how do we retrieve the data for this vault we just created, right? Pretend I'm someone who's never worked with S3 Glacier before. How can I very quickly find the API I need? Okay, well, I want to return data about a Glacier entity, right? So we're in the Amazon S3 Glacier service. So I'm going to start by looking at all the command line interface APIs that exist under the S3 Glacier umbrella. So that's exactly what I do here. I Google Glacier AWS CLI. The first link that pops up here is for the Glacier service. I go to that link, and then there's a huge list of available commands. I kind of just scan the commands, and I see there's one called get vault lock, get vault notifications, get vault, all this stuff, and then there's one called list vaults. Okay, so if I want to just return a list of vaults, that's probably a good API I'm going to use. I might have misspoken earlier. We're just trying to list the vaults in this case. I don't think we're trying to grab the specific details about it. So list vaults makes sense. That kind of corresponds with the data that is returned here, or kind of the action that's returned here. So I'm going to click into list vaults, and it gives me some documentation. It describes what the API does, and then we have instructions here on how to call the API. So it's saying you're going to do, this is the Glacier service, remember, and you can get the service name from here. So sometimes, like, this is the full name of this is Amazon S3 Glacier, but when you go to do it on the command line, you're just going to use this first word here for the service name. So it's going to be AWS Glacier and then our API name. And our API name in this case is going to be list vaults. So it's going to be AWS Glacier list vaults, and then it looks like we need to provide an account ID. Remember, the account ID is the specific 12-digit number to your AWS account. So then I'm just going to put it all together, and this is just showing how I incrementally build it. So if you do AWS and don't put in a service name, it'll give you a big list of service names that you should use. So then I do AWS Glacier list vaults, so AWS, my service name, and then my API name, and then I get an error message back saying we need account ID, because remember it said here you need account ID. So then I put in my account ID. I also specify the region just to be absolutely sure that I'm referencing the right region, because remember, if you reference the wrong region, like nothing will be returned because nothing exists in that region. So I specify the right region, and then again, I'll talk about this profile flag later. You don't need to worry about it, but this profile flag is just handling the auth. And then once I run that command, my vault gets returned. And so, that whole process might just take several minutes. So I was able to go into a service I'd never seen before, Glacier. I was able to kind of click around and see that a list of vaults get returned. Okay, so there's a good chance there's an API called list vaults. I went ahead and went into the technical documentation, quickly found a list vaults API. I noticed there's a bunch of other list APIs and get APIs and create APIs, right? If we want to create a vault, we could always run the create vault. The parallel of the create vault API would be clicking the create vault button, right? It's like they're pretty parallel in that sense. In this case, we looked at list vaults. We looked at the documentation to figure out how to run list vaults, and we ran it. And so that takes several minutes, and we're able to get a command line instruction to call the AWS API. It's that simple. It's not super complex. You basically Google the service technical documentation. That'll give you back a list of APIs, and then you choose the API that works the best for you, and the API names are all really user-friendly, so it's really easy to tell what you need to call. And I'll just reiterate again that if you're overwhelmed by the APIs, just thinking about the parallels you would do in the console and matching that up, or thinking about what the corresponding parallel API might be for the command line interface that does similar functionality. And with that, I'm going to hop over to my browser real quick and basically run through all this, so you can just skip that if you're not interested in it. Okay, so I'm in my AWS account here. I'm going to go ahead and create the Glacier vault like I showed in the slide. So again, Glacier is a service. I search for Glacier. There it is. Open that in a new tab. I'm in the US East 1 region at the moment, FYI. And you can see, the console is pretty self-explanatory. I can create a vault. Let's call this presentation vault. And then I'm going to just create vault. And remember, this button of create resource, that's another parallel you can think of with the command line interface, where when you're filling out these forms and hitting create something or update something or something of that effect, then there's probably a parallel to that in the command line interface that you could call to achieve the same objective. So I'm going to hit create vault. Okay, my vault gets created right away. Cool. And you can see that my vault gets listed here. I can hit this little refresh button, and my vault is listed in my console. So how can I get this same data, or how can I get this list returned in the command line interface? So, I'm a developer. I've come in. I need the command line interface API, and I navigate to Amazon S3 Glacier. I go into vaults, and I see this. Okay, well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the Glacier service. So I'm literally just going to Google AWS Glacier CLI. First link that pops up, documentation for this service. Click that, scroll down. Here's all the available APIs. So remember, I created a vault. You could have also created a vault through the API with this create vault API. And then there's also a delete vault. So if we were done with the vault, we could probably call delete vault on it and delete it. In this case, we're interested in the list API. So I go down to list vaults here, and I'm going to click into that. Gives you a little description here, right? This operation lists all vaults owned by the caller's account. We scroll down a bit. Here's how we would call the API, and I'll do it in my Kali instance here in a second. Before I go there, I'm just going to say that this is all from the command line. If you're interested in Bodo 3 or scripting or something of that nature, you can, I spelled it wrong here, but again, you can just Google AWS Glacier, so AWS the service name, and in this case, the Boto 3 SDK is the one I want to use. And you can see once again, the first link that pops up is documentation, but this time we're talking about the Python library. We're not doing it from the command line interface. But again, these SDKs usually, or at least Boto 3, usually has a corresponding function name, or a function name that corresponds to the CLI. So they're like pretty similar. So we were looking at list vaults, and over here in Boto 3, if I scroll down, there is a function called list vaults. So if you want to script this in Python as opposed to doing it to the command line, you could also go through this process and find the appropriate documentation for what exactly to call. With that, I will jump over to my Kali instance. Okay, so remember we have the AWS command, or we have the AWS command installed on our Kali Linux. So I'm going to go ahead and call the list vaults API. So AWS, that's the keyword, and then the service name is Glacier. And remember, we got that service name from the command line interface. So like this is the name we would use in our CLI instruction. In some cases, it might not be exactly the same as the service. Like you would still Google the service name in CLI, but sometimes this name is slightly different. But this is the name you would take at the top of the documentation page. So in this case, it's just Glacier. So going back to Kali, we have Glacier, and then list vaults, and then account ID. And then let's grab our account ID. Remember, you can just grab it from the UI up here. So actually, let me zoom in a bit. So you can, there we go. So again, here's the vault we created, and I'm going to grab the command, or the account ID up here. I hit this button to copy it. So now it's copied. I go back to my Kali Linux. There is my number, again, the 12-digit number. And that should be all we need. Let's go ahead and specify the region just to be safe. So US East 1 is where this is. And again, you don't have to worry about it now, but I'm adding the profile flag to basically provide the authentication. So if I run this, yep, and here comes back our vault. So we get the ARN, the name, the creation date, number of archives, size, and bytes. So that's list vaults. And again, we could, like I was talking about create vault, so we created the vault through the UI, but let's say we want to do it through the command line. We can scroll down and there is a create vault API, right? Pretty self-explanatory. I click create vault. You have to supply this stuff. So you need to supply the account ID again and the vault name. So here's the vaults we have right now. And if I switch over to Kali, I'm going to do AWS Glacier, and then the API is called create vault. The account ID is this up here. The vault name, let's call it CLI vault test. Region, let's specify US East 1. Let's make it in the same region. Profile, that's our authentication. Don't have to worry about that for now. User 1. Okay, if I run this, it returns basically like the equivalent of a 200 OK. So it's basically telling me that the vault has been created. And if you want to get really into the weeds in these documentation pages, it will usually tell you, yeah, it'll tell you the output. So it's saying that the URI of the vault will be returned. And that's what we saw over in our Kali. So let's see if it actually worked. So if we go back to the UI and we go into our Glacier, we only have one vault here now, but we should have created one through the CLI. If I go ahead and click refresh, there's the one we created through the CLI. So we created this one totally from the command line. We didn't need to click any of the buttons, and you could essentially extrapolate what APIs you need to call based off the parallel actions you would do in the user interface or the console. So that concludes this video. We covered the console, we covered the command line interface using the get functions API call from the Lambda service as an example. We briefly talked about you can abstracting the CLI one step further and using things like Bodo3 or libraries like Bodo3 in Python to essentially script out the behavior that you would normally do from the command line interface if you want to make a large script. And then we showed how you can very quickly find the API you need through kind of a set methodology of searching under the service name and then the specific API you need through the technical documentation. And I offered that hopefully helpful tip of if you're ever stuck on what exactly you need to call to get or create the data, just think about how you would normally do it from the console or UI, and you can kind of find the parallel usually in the command line interface documentation like we did. One thing that might have been bothering you throughout all this is I kept talking about this profile flag. So you'll see in the picture on the right here, profile test user. I used profile user 1, but I kept telling you that the profile flag is providing the authentication to that AWS CLI command. And so that's what the next video is going to focus on. I'm going to go into IAM. I'm going to explain what that profile flag is, what are users' roles, access keys, all that kind of stuff. If you're interested in that, go ahead and watch the next video, and I'll go ahead and end this here.